Hello again, this is Aaron to you too, and this is the second video about Dragon Warrior Randomizer enemies. This one, we already talked a little bit about Zone 0. This one we're going to do Zones 1 and 2. So, which they're actually the same thing, but they're different zones, but the same potential enemies. So we'll hit to that here in just a second. So here we have the listing from what we did before. We're going to move right past that. To understand about zones 1 and 2, and you can already see the enemies popping up right there. Zone 1 and 2 is a 15 by 15 zones east-west, which is zone 1 of zone 0, and 15 zones north-south, zone 2 of zone 0. So what that means is that wherever the Tantagel zone is, that 15 by 15 block, which again, Tantagel can be at any point inside of it, the zones east and west are called zone 1, and they are identical to each other. And the ones north and south are called zone 2, and they are identical to each other. It's important to know that. Zone 1 and zone 2 have different enemies in them, but at max include all of the zone 0 group plus Druid, Poltergeist, Droll, Drakima, Skeleton, Warlock, Metal Scorpion, and Wolf. So what you can see out in like zone 1 could have, you know, Druid, Poltergeist, Droll, Drakima, Skeleton. Zone 2 could have none of those same enemies, but it will still have some combination of, like, say it'll have Magician, Midriki, Scorpion, Warlock, and Metal Scorpion. So it can have a different combination of the enemies, but it will still be only these groups. So you have the ability to avoid some of the more lethal enemies in the game at the start most of the time. There are some seeds that the map will make it very difficult to access these zones, but for the most part, you should be able to do it. So we're going to go into each enemy now. The Druid has 17 to 22 HP, 14 XP, and it has 2 times dodge. All of these Zone 1 and 2 enemies have an elevated level of dodge. It's a little odd because after this, it's kind of hit or miss, but a couple of the highest dodge enemies in the game are in Zone 2. I'm just going to call them all Zone 2 instead of saying Zone 1 and 2. That's how I kind of reference it in my mind. You know, odd numbers, or whatever. So anyway, the Druid is a very inefficient enemy, experience-wise. They give less experience, and we can still see it up here. Less experience than a Scorpion, more hit points. They have more defense. They have more everything than a Scorpion, but they're worth less experience. It's, I don't know. It's just one of the things about Dragon Warrior Randomizer. The tweaks that they made didn't quite even out, so. Anyway, it's a very inefficient enemy, but it will usually die to 2 hurt or fairy waters. So, which is good to know. And you want to, like, if you see it, you usually still want to kill them. But they are not one of the more appealing enemies. I probably didn't want to go that high, actually, because our next enemy, the Poltergeist, we also want to compare a little bit to the Scorpion. So Poltergeist is 18 to 23 hit points, 15 XP, and has 6 times the dodge. So the meme, Poltergeists are the worst, is based on how, like, in value. No, that's not the right word. What's the right word? How little they are worth fighting due to high dodge, etc. Like, again, basically they have more hit points than a Druid, worth 1 more experience, a lot harder to hit. And we already said Druids aren't very good. Poltergeists are one of the least valuable enemies to fight in the game. However, if you don't have a lot of good options, you're still probably going to swing on them. Especially, a lot of times early game, it's can I 2-shot them? If you can do that, they're still likely to go down more often than not to hurt or fairy water. uses, but a little less likely than the Druid. They do not have any sleep resistance, however, so casting sleep on a Poltergeist to with a reasonable amount of attack power but possibly no heals is an option too, because one thing that sleep will do, and I might do a sleep video at some point later because it will do detail this a little bit more, but one thing that sleep does is once just an enemy is asleep, it has no dodge resistance. So that dodge rate gets completely eliminated by sleep. So if you have to fight Poltergeist, usually it's better when you have the sleep spell. Now, again, all that granted, they're still worth less than a Scorpion, so great. I'll move on to the last of kind of the beginning group here of enemies in here, which is the Droll. This has 15 to 20 hit points, 18 experience, and 2 times dodge. They are a nice enemy to see when you can't take out some of the tougher enemies in a group. By that, I mean their hit points are a little bit lower. They actually not quite the lowest in the group. There's 2 others that have even less hit points. And their agility is a little bit higher, but you know, they're a better hurt fairy water target than a Druid or a Poltergeist. And 2 torches isn't likely to kill one. It's not 50-50 odds, but it's pretty decent. So in that scenario, that might be worthwhile. They're still not one of the more useful enemies in this zone, in Zone 2, but still an interesting one to take on, I think. So, Drakimas. And yeah, here's where things tend to start to be a little crazy, where the game really puts in some extra thought into what you have here. So Drakima has very low hit points, 12 to 16. It's barely more than a Scorpion, but worth 20 experience. The one thing it has negative about it is that 6 times dodge, same as the Poltergeist. They are a nice early hurt target. And they are worth swinging at if you can 2-shot them reliably despite the dodge. They have mild sleep resist, which is 1/8. So using sleep to avoid dodge has lower rate than just risking the dodge. So if you were thinking, I don't want to get hit by this guy, and I don't want him to dodge me and take an extra round, so maybe I'll cast sleep because that's the same, then I basically assume 1 dodge, take that out, and can keep swinging and maybe not take any damage, which is a strat that you think about in this group if you have an early sleep. It's not really worth it for a Drakima. It depends on how hard they hit you, but the chance to dodge you, 6 out of 64 is, well, heck, I'll just show it on screen here. 6 divided by 64 is 9%. And what is 1 divided by 8? That's 0.125. So you actually have a greater chance of failing asleep than you do having him dodge you. Still, it's annoying, but it's something to keep in mind. Whereas a Poltergeist, sleeping them is, I think, a little bit more reliable. So, moving on to our next enemy is the Skeleton. And this is where the enemies start to get a little bit more fun. Like, Drakima is kind of a fun enemy. The Skeleton is kind of a fun enemy. But they do have that 4x dodge. 25 experience, so it's the first time the experience really kicks up a little bit. They are reasonably efficient to fight normally, but also have no sleep resist and decent odds to kill with 2 hurts or fairy water. The reason why I say that number 2, if you can finish a battle in 2 rounds, that's normally a good fight. When it's 3 rounds, you need to think about it a little bit more, but if you can 2-shot something, that's usually pretty good. So, and again, sometimes you'll have to do 3, and sometimes it's worth it to do that. But 2 shots usually mean you're taking 1, maybe 2 hits. And early on, especially if you don't have a heal spell, that can be really important. So Skeletons are one of the best Zone 2 enemies, though. They're usually pretty reliable. The dodge is a little bit annoying, but we'll see how that can kind of compare to, say, a Warlock, who has 21 to 28 hit points, 28 experience, only 2 times dodge. They do have 3 out of 16 sleep resist. Let's say same strength and agility as Skeleton. but slightly less likely to two-shot early. So if you ask me to compare these two, I would say that I would rather fight a skeleton most of the time. If I'm just swinging maybe a warlock, but that extra 3 hit points probably matters more than the double dodge rate when it comes to being able to two-shot a warlock or even three-shot it. You're likely spending an extra round or the same amount of rounds killing a warlock as a skeleton. It is worth 3 extra experience, but I find myself most interested in fighting warlocks when I can two-shot them, or when I have hurt more but really low hit points and I don't want to leave the beginning zones. So that's what I would say. Yeah, and with hurt and fairy water, again, average hurt damage is 12.5 hurt and fairy water. So you're looking at 25. You're right in the middle of its range. Whereas here, you're on average going to kill every possible skeleton. So it's all about math when it comes to this sort of stuff. And now we're getting into the fun enemies. Everyone likes to talk about these guys, so to bring them up as much as possible, because these are what people think about when they think of Zone 0 enemies. So you have the Metal Scorpion, or Zone 2 enemies, which have 14 to 18 hit points, 31 experience, 2 times dodge. They have 42 agility, however, so hard to physically kill early, but incredibly efficient with hurt, fairy water, no sleep resist, so that's something you can keep in mind too, especially if they have a somewhat annoying ability like weak breath or hurt to limit the amount of damage you take. Also, their attack power isn't inconsequential. It is the highest we've seen at this point. It's at 36, pretty close to the wolf actually, so they're still going to hurt you kind of little, so you want to be a little careful about this. However, one thing I want to mention about this enemy, they're my favorite zone. They're my favorite early game enemy, period, just because of how little hit points they have, and it's very easy. 2 torches, a torch on average does 7.5 damage. So 2 torches, 15 damage can kill Metal Scorpions, has a reasonable likelihood of doing so. 1 fairy water has a slim chance or hurt, but can do it. If you have any bit of damage, you can possibly swing on top of it to take them out. Fairy water plus torch is actually a very high odds combo to take them out too. So what I want to add here, though, is that one-shotting Metal Scorpions is actually worthwhile throughout most of the game. As their low HP makes them almost always a great fight once you can overcome their defense. So basically what I'm saying here is that, and I'm going to push this up a little bit so my face doesn't block anything. Metal Scorpions are usually pretty good, but they're a little bit hard to get to. Once you can get over the hump and fight Metal Scorpions more reliably, they're a great fight to do. Again, if they have a bad ability, you're not going to want to deal with that, but that's the same for everyone else. I think they're one of the most efficient fights in the game. I believe, yeah, if I'm looking at it here, I think even Archfield on his guide puts them, I think he ranks them 14th out of 38, and that list is very heavily weighted by the Sharlock enemies because the amount of experience they give, it just accelerates so dramatically. So, again, just things to keep in mind. Don't worry too much about that. And then we go into the last enemy, the wolf. Now, the wolf has 25 to 33 hit points, 40 experience, and has 2x dodge, same as some of these other enemies. They are the hardest hitting, I'm glad that auto-filled for me, and most difficult enemy possible in Zone 0 to 2, but are usually great to see, as they can make a Zone 1 to 2 grind's value last another level or 2 longer than otherwise. A lot of people really like to see wolves. Again, I think Metal Scorpions are a little bit better. Even though they're not worth as much experience, they're just a lot easier to kill by and large. Wolves don't have as much agility as Metal Scorpions do, so they're a little easier to damage. But you know, looking at this, this is probably, you have a slim chance of 2 Fairy Waters or Hurts killing them. It's more likely going to take 3. You could possibly take 4 with some really bad rolls, some bad luck in there. Torches aren't super viable. They do have 1 out of 16 sleep resist. So in my mind, anything that has 1 out of 16, I just assume is 0. I don't worry about it. Like, you don't go after, you know, you'll hear a lot of people at the end game grinds, like Axe Knights. They have 1 out of 16 hurt more resist. That doesn't stop people from using hurt more on them. 1 out of 16 sleep resist will not stop me from using sleep on a wolf. So, and that can be a great way to mitigate their damage, as they have 40 strength. They are the highest damaging enemy here at the beginning of the game. Oh yeah, that's and like I mentioned here, you oftentimes can't really fight the wolf well the moment you start into the zone. You have to be a little careful about that, because you don't want to, you know, there's so many good enemies here in Zone 2, the second zone, that you really have to kind of focus on. Again, I say Zone 2, I mean Zone 1 and 2. I just get tired of saying both of the things. It's the second zones that you look at. That's kind of how I think about it. So, yeah, they can be a little bit challenging, but they're still a really good fight. And in fact, whenever we get to doing a mid-game zones video, and we start doing that, you'll see the wolf is actually a lot better than a lot of the early enemies that you fight outside of it. So that's what I mean by it can extend the value of this. If you're, let's say you're level, you know, 7 or 8, and the experience is starting to kick up a notch, and you're thinking, maybe I'm not getting enough. Well, if you have wolves in the zone, then that is, you know, you can compare that to things like a Droll Magi, which is worth 18 more experience, but a lot harder to kill, or a Druid Lord, who's worth 7 more experience, but a lot harder to kill. It makes those, you know, sticking around home and grinding on the easier enemies a little bit more valuable, which you like to see. Anyway, this is it for this video. I think the next video I do might actually be about Sharlock enemies, because the mid-game group is going to be really long. And, yeah, there's just, there's so many people in it, and even though there's a lot of different ways of doing it, I think that there'll be a little bit more interest in these Sharlock enemies specifically, and I want to make sure I'm getting out the things that will be most useful to people. So, all right, thank you very much, and hopefully this helps.